Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mona Franson. I'm with the Outreach and Sales Distribution Services team. Today, we are joined by Bianca Vargas, who's from our Policy, Eligibility, and Research Division. She's here to present a webinar, and I'm going to hand that over to her in just a moment. I just want to remind you that when this webinar is over, we will work to get it posted on our webinars and downloads page and also sent out in a communication to you, hopefully by the end of this week. When we do, we will also send you the slide deck, which contains links that are in this presentation, which you will have access to when you receive. Without anything else, I want to say welcome, Bianca, and we're so happy to have you here.
Hello, good afternoon, and welcome certified enrollers. Thank you for taking the time to attend this webinar during the open enrollment season. I am Bianca Vargas. I work in the Policy, Eligibility, and Research Division, and our webinar topic today is Program Eligibility by Federal Poverty Level. So let's get started. All right. So we're here today to discuss the Federal Poverty Level chart. That's our main topic. This is a chart that I'm sure is familiar to all enrollers. It's hosted on the coveredcalifornia.com website. It contains a lot of layered, complex, really dense information, and it changes periodically. So we're here to understand this chart in more depth, and we'll return to it at the end of the webinar and hopefully see it with more clarity, and it'll hopefully be more useful and understandable at that time. Our agenda for today is here. We're going to start off looking at the regulations that govern the usage of FPL for Covered California. We're going to look at similar rules for Medi-Cal. We'll take a look at the specific FPL limits per program. We'll review the online application FPL update timeline, so the important time frames when the FPL changes or the usage changes. We'll talk about consequences of those updates. Take a brief look at family size, and then return again to the FPL chart with that new information. And there'll be some time for questions. So I'll be speaking for about 30 minutes on the slide, and then we'll open up for some typed-in questions. So we'll start out looking at the rules. So FPL, the Federal Poverty Level, is a set of income guidelines or limits. They're issued by the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. They're published annually in late January in the Federal Register. And they're used by lots of different government and safety net programs to determine financial eligibility. We use them here on our online application to determine financial eligibility for the various programs on the Covered California application. I've listed those programs out here. They're in two categories with the sub-programs listed beneath. So we can think about the application as looking at financial eligibility for Medi-Cal programs on one hand and Covered California programs on another. And the specific programs under the main program categories are Medi-Cal for adults, for children and pregnant women. There's a separately administered program for pregnant women called Medi-Cal Access Program, or MCAP. And then for kids in San Mateo, Santa Clara, and San Francisco, there's an additional program called the County Children's Health Initiative Program, or CCHIP. And then under the Covered California umbrella, we have our main program, APTC, Advanced Premium Tax Credits, which is sometimes called financial assistance, can also be called premium assistance or tax subsidies. That's our main program. We also have a cost-sharing reduction program, those 3 levels of enhanced silver plans. And we have our American Indian Alaska Native zero cost-sharing plans. So that's the suite of different programs that are on the online application and that FPL is used to assess eligibility for. So if we turn to the guidelines, the regulations that Covered California uses for implementation of FPL, I've cited here the California Code of Regulations, but there's an almost identical citation in the federal law, And the definition here, it says federal poverty level means the most recently published federal poverty level updated periodically in the Federal Register by the Secretary of Health and Human Services pursuant to that section as of the first day of the annual open enrollment period for coverage in a QHP through the exchange. So that means that for coverage in a given plan year, Covered California uses the FPL guidelines published in the prior year to determine eligibility for APTC, CSR, and AIAN plans. And if we take this most recent plan year as an example, we can walk through that and see how that works. So for plan year 2019, the most recently published federal poverty level as of the first day of annual open enrollment period, open enrollment started on October 15th, 2018 for plan year 2019. As of that time, the most recently published FPL was from January 2018. So we're going to take that FPL table from January 2018 and we'll use it to assess eligibility for determinations for plan year 2019. That's represented graphically here on this graph, or this graphic. You can see the main bar for representing 2019 Covered California plan year, 1/1 to 12/31, and you see the different routes into coverage for 2019. So you can see that people can get into 2019 coverage by being an existing consumer who is renewed, coming in as a new consumer in open enrollment, or coming in during the actual plan year in a special enrollment period and getting that 2019 coverage. And for all of those groups, eligibility for APTC CSR in 2019 will be determined using the FPLs of the prior year, that is 2018, no matter when the application was submitted. And you can see that the advantage there to that, or the reasoning, is so that we treat all those populations the same when assessing their eligibility for APTC CSR. So if we turn to the regulations that Medi-Cal uses, they actually submit their implementation of their FPL usage to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services via their state plan, and they implement that state plan by issuing all county welfare directors letters for FPL. That's how they implement those guidelines. Each January, the California Department of Healthcare Services distributes income limits based on the most recently published federal guidelines of that same year. So if we look at 2018, this plan year, this coverage year for Medi-Cal, in January of this year, many months ago, DHCS sent an all-county welfare directors letter that said, for applicants and beneficiaries who are parent, caretaker, relatives, children, pregnant persons, and non-Medicare recipients who are age 19 up to 65, whose eligibility is determined based upon modified adjusted gross income methodologies, the new FPLs are effective January 1st, 2018, due to whole month eligibility. So they're saying here that in January 2018, they're going to use January 2018 FPLs to determine eligibility. Again, in red there, for coverage in a given plan year, Medi-Cal uses the FPL guidelines published in that same year to determine eligibility for its various programs. So if we look at the graphic representation of that rule, it's much more straightforward than the Covered California depiction, where we have 2018 Medi-Cal coverage, use 2018 FPLs to assess eligibility, in 2019, use 2019 FPLs. So this is a representation of the rules. The implementation is a little different. We'll get to that in a second. Here we have just a review of the specific FPL limits by program. These are all those programs that were listed on earlier slides. So we take our two main programs, Covered California and Medi-Cal. They each have many sub-programs with different associated FPL limits that are assessed by FPLs either of the prior year or the current year, depending on the main program category. So taking the Covered California side, we see that the APTC program, you have to fall between FPL 100 and 400%. we assess eligibility using prior year FPL. That little asterisk is there. It represents APTC CSR eligibility for certain immigration statuses that would normally be covered under Medi-Cal because of low income, but because they're not eligible for Medi-Cal due to their immigration status, for some limited list of immigration statuses, they come back to covered California and are eligible for our programs. Not only APTC, but that first level enhanced silver plan that goes from 100 to 150%. Then we have the Silver 87 enhanced silver from 150 to 200% FPL, Silver 73 200 to 250, and finally the AIA and zero cost sharing plan from 100 to 300% FPL. Again, all assessed using the FPL limits of the prior year. Turning to the Medi-Cal side, they have many programs as well. There is Medi-Cal coverage for adults up to 138% FPL. Again, they're looking at the current FPL table to assess that eligibility. They cover children up to 266%. They also have a Medi-Cal administered program for pregnant women up to 213%, and then a separately administered program, but still under the Medi-Cal umbrella, called MCAP. That's for pregnant women who are just above the other programs limits. 213 to 322 is for MCAP, and finally CCHIP 266 to 322. And you can really see here Medi-Cal's mission to cover low-income and vulnerable populations such as children and pregnant women. So if we turn to the implementation of these rules, we'll take a deeper look at how they work out in the online application system. For FPL levels and changes, there are really two important time frames. In the fall, the new FPL limits for covered California annual renewals and open enrollment come into play. And in the spring, the new current year FPLs for Medi-Cal eligibility are updated. So here is the important time frame for covered California in the fall. We have the same graphic representing the different venues into the 2019 plan year. And in the dotted vertical green line on the left, we see the representation of the 2018 FPLs being used to determine covered California eligibility for renewals, open enrollment, and 2019 SEPs. For those transactions, we're going to use the 2018 FPL tables as appropriate. And ongoing in a separate track, but at the same time, depending on the transaction type or the coverage year sought, we're going to also be using the 2017 FPL table to continue in use for the 2018 SEP coverage that's happening through the end of the year. These are special enrollers coming in for the last few months of coverage from fall to 12/31. This is kind of a complex time in the online system because it's trying to use different FPL tables depending on the coverage that that consumer is seeking. The important time frame in the online application for Medi-Cal is in the spring. And we see that represented here. This is the plan year for Medi-Cal coverage, both in 2018 and then represented there in orange for 2019. The vertical green line here represents the 2019 FPLs being loaded for Medi-Cal eligibility determinations. So if you look at the yellow lines on the bottom there, we see that the online application is using 2018 FPLs into the beginning of the 2019 coverage year, when theoretically we would want it to align exactly at 1/1. We know that's not possible because they're not even published until late January. So we update them as early as we can, sometimes in March, occasionally in April, but in the spring, those online FPLs come into alignment with the coverage year for Medi-Cal eligibility determinations. The yellow arrow is representing possible retroactive Medi-Cal eligibility determinations where transactions happen in the online system using the new or updated Medi-Cal FPL limits and change eligibility possibly retroactively to earlier points in the year. So you can start to see some of the consequences to eligibility in the online system, and we'll get a little deeper into that. So as we start to think of the consequences, the most important underlying concept to understand is the order of operations in the online application system. The application will always be screened for Medi-Cal eligibility first. So all of the eligibility factors that are entered into the application will be accounted for, including income. The system will take a look at current monthly income and compare whatever that entered income is to the most current Medi-Cal FPLs known in the system at that time. If no Medi-Cal eligibility is detected, the application looks for eligibility for advanced premium tax credit, or CSR, or frankly an AIAN plan if relevant, using annual income and prior year FPLs. So the entire case eligibility is run each time a new application or reported change is submitted using this prioritization system. That is looking for Medi-Cal eligibility first, using whatever the current Medi-Cal FPLs are known to the system, and then turning to eligibility for covered California programs. So here, this is a representation of what happened last year in the spring, what will happen again next spring, but this is the numbers we know of, which happened last year when we moved from 2017 FPLs to 2018 for the different Medi-Cal cutoffs. So we have there in the light orange, the adult Medi-Cal 138 FPL program cutoff. It rose for a family size of 1 up $111, for example, from one FPL table to the next. And then for pregnant women at 213, for Medi-Cal kids at 266, and for CCHIP and MCAP eligibility at 322, we had similar increases to the eligibility limits across the FPL table and across the online system. So if we look at an example scenario for consequences of that Medi-Cal update, if in 2017 we had a family of 3 come in through the Covered California open enrollment period, and it was 2 parents and 1 child with a household income of $55,000, everyone would be in Covered California with APTC. After the green line spring update, the Medi-Cal income thresholds would go up, and the child would go to Medi-Cal if the application is updated and family size and income, FPL, stay the same. So let's go back to that chart and look if we see, I don't know if you can see me. Oh yeah, great. So here we are online for family size of 3. We can see that the parents clearly exceed adult coverage in Medi-Cal. The child is also at a family size or household income of $55,000, exceeds the child coverage limit. But after the spring update, the household income is under $55,275, and so that child would go to Medi-Cal if any changes happened to the application, and FPL stayed the same. That is, the income and family size criteria didn't change during that update. That child would be reassessed and go to Medi-Cal for kids. So we're going to turn briefly to family size, which is one of the 2 variables that is important in determining FPL, the other being income. Income is such a complex computation, and frankly, if you go stepwise through the application and enter the income and deduction categories as as presented, it's automatically assessed and calculated. We know that there are certain changes to income and deduction categories as a result of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We'll be changing those application categories in the next few months, so we're working on updating that and making MAGI income calculation very accurate. For now, we'll just turn to family size, which is a concept that's a little less complex, but still really relevant to where a family would fall on the FPL table. Family size for covered California is pretty straightforward. It's just the number of people in the tax household. There's an exception. Household members who are not lawfully present aren't counted in the family size. Their income is accounted for by a specific multiplier. But for covered California, it's pretty straightforward. We give APTC out in tax household units, and that's what family size is the tax household. Medi-Cal has much more complex rules regarding family size. They take into account different custodial relationships. They cover people who aren't tax filers, whereas covered California doesn't. They're concerned with who lives in under the same roof together. It's just a different program for accounting for household composition. But probably the most notable difference and the easiest to understand is that Medi-Cal includes the number of unborn babies in family size if anyone in the household is pregnant, while covered California does not. And that can have really consequential differences when using the FPL chart to try to determine which program the family or that person will fall into. So we'll just look at the FPL chart again after having reviewed these slides and see what jumps out. I've shaded the covered California columns in yellow. Those right now, because this is the FPL chart for the 2019 plan year, as we just reviewed, all of those columns will be the 2018 FPL limit numbers, right? And those will stay the same the entire plan year 2019. All eligibility for our programs will be assessed using these numbers for coverage in 2019. The unshaded columns relate to Medi-Cal eligibility limits and Medi-Cal programs. Those, because we're in 2018 now, and this is a real-time capture of the current FPL chart, those are still 2018 limits that Medi-Cal is using to assess eligibility for their programs. They'll be updated, and this chart will be updated in the spring of 2019 when the online system uses new dollar amounts and limits. We'll come to this chart and make that update as well. So coming to the summary of what I wanted to present today, again, just driving home that APTC CSR eligibility uses prior year FPLs. Medi-Cal eligibility uses current year FPLs. There are case impacts if the application is changed after the spring Medi-Cal FPL update. And that the FPL chart that's hosted at coveredcalifornia.com displays the dollar amounts currently used by the system and is updated in the spring and in the fall prior to the open enrollment season to reflect what the system is actually doing. And you can see in the live link at the .com site, in the lower right, the chart will always have a date so that you will know when it was last updated, whether it's sort of the fall update or the spring update. But know that it'll always display the dollar amounts that are in use by the system. So that brings me to the end of the slide presentation, but I want to take a moment offline to look at some of the questions that have come in, and we'll see if there are some common themes. Hello again, this is Bianca. We've been reviewing your many excellent questions. Just some high-level ones off the top. Does the system automatically go back and check for Medi-Cal once the new FPL amounts are released? No. No, it doesn't. There's no mass sweep of all cases to try to find new Medi-Cal eligibility. It really only happens when a change is made and someone actively goes into the application and submits a change. That can be an agent, that can be the consumer themselves. In the case of a mixed family, where we have a mixed program family with some in Medi-Cal and some on Covered California, the county can certainly make transactions on that case that might have consequences for the Covered California folks on the application, especially if they're lowering income or adding a family member or someone's pregnant. Can have radical consequences for the case. But no, there's not a population-wide sweep to try to find more Medi-Cal eligibility. We also got some comments that C-CHIP and MCAP aren't Medi-Cal. Yes, that's true. C-CHIP and Medi-Cal are partially joint administered with Medi-Cal, and yes, they are different from the Medi-Cal program, the MAGI programs for adults and children, for example. Aid codes are quite different among all the different programs that I listed. But generally, DHCS has a hand in administering both MCAP and C-CHIP. Okay, here's another question. Do regulations require eligibility determinations to remain unchanged when items do not affect eligibility, such as a minor update to email or phone? Right. It's true that not every change made in the application affects or should affect eligibility. We're very aware that people come in to fix typos or add an email address or even move across the street but not to a different plan region, so they shouldn't be necessarily rerun for eligibility. We're working to make the application more nimble in that respect. And there are some scenarios where we already have cached information, that is stored information, so that we're not necessarily rechecking every aspect of eligibility. But generally, I would like enrollers to be aware that for most times when the application is changed, eligibility will be rerun, or you can assume that just in case that's what indeed happens. But we're working to make the application more modular in that respect, so that is coming. We're getting so many different questions, and they're from so many different points of interest that I think the best way to handle that would be to do a written response on the remaining questions, so that I can be more thorough and thoughtful in the response. So we'll leave it here for now, and we'll get back to you in written form.
I want to thank you, Bianca, for joining us. I want to thank everyone else during this busy time. And again, as a reminder, we will be posting this to our webinars and briefings page. And then we will be releasing this in our agent and community partner alert, hopefully by the end of this week, which you will have access to the deck and this recording. And then also there was a couple questions on where the FPL chart lives. It does live in some of our toolkits, but you can also go to coveredca.com and search in the search function at the top right, and you can type in income guidelines, FPL, many different searches, and you'll be able to pull up the chart from there. Again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bianca. Have a great afternoon.